everyone, I am 𝓒𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 and welcome to Classes 𝓒𝓱𝓪. In this video, I will explain Class 12th Political Science Chapter 2, which is Era of One-Party Dominance. Now, in the first chapter of this book, we studied about the first challenge that India had to face as an independent nation, which was the challenge of nation building. Now, in that chapter, we saw two other challenges as well, and the second one of them was the challenge of instituting democracy in the country, and that is what we will be studying in this chapter. In this chapter, basically, we will be studying about democratic politics, and when we say about democratic politics, it refers to electoral politics that comes with it as well. Basically, in this chapter, we will be seeing the electoral politics of the country after a decade after independence. So what happened for a decade after independence, that will be the major point of discussion in this chapter. We will be studying about the electoral politics to understand how the system of free and fair elections has been established. Secondly, the nature of the one-party dominance. Now, one-party dominance here refers to the dominance of the Congress Party. So, we will be seeing the nature of the dominance of the Congress Party in the politics of the country. Thirdly, we will be seeing the emergence of the opposition party, because for the well-functioning of a democracy, we need a ruling party as well as an opposition party. So, we will be seeing these three main points of discussion in this chapter. In this chapter, basically what we will be studying is that how India as a country, as a nearly independent nation, established democracy, because it was a huge task to establish democracy as a newly independent country at that time. So without any further ado, let's get started with the first topic, which is challenge of building democracy. Now, you know that when a country becomes independent, it gets many problems. There are many circumstances which it has to face as a newly independent country, which we saw in the first chapter as well. And that is why leaders of many newly independent countries decided that they could not afford to have democracy in their country, because if they introduce democracy in the country, it will introduce new differences in the country. It will have the existence of differences and conflicts in the country, and that's what they did not want to have, because their first priority as a newly independent nation was the national unity of the country, and that is why they could not afford to have democracy in the country, and that is why they adopted non-democratic politics in the country. Non-democratic politics was also in many different forms. It included direct army rule or nominal democracy but effective control by one leader. But what about India? As you know that India also faced the same challenges. It also faced the challenge of nation building. But what was different in India was the choice of the Indian political leaders. Indian leaders from the time of freedom struggle had been deeply committed to the idea of democracy. So it was out of question that whether after independence India would be democracy or not. Because as a newly independent country, of course, there were many other countries which did not adopt democracy, but that was not the case for India, and that is why democratic politics was adopted in India. How they adopted it, we will be studying in this chapter, but for now, you have to know that India adopted democratic politics in the country even immediately after independence, and that was because the thinking of all those leaders at that time was because they considered democratic politics as a solution to all the problems of the country. All the problems that India as a newly independent nation was facing, democracy was considered as a solution for all those problems, and that is why it was considered important. And as we know that the Constitution of India, which was adopted on 26 November 1949 and had come into effect on 26 January 1950. Now, because elections, if you're holding democracy in the country, if there has to be democratic politics in the country, then of course it's important to have a government which is elected by the people. And if there has to be government which has to be elected by the people, then what is the important point? That you have to hold elections in the country, and the provisions for all the elections will be in the constitution. And that is why from the period of 1947 to 1950, when the constitution of India was being written, at that time there was no elected government in the country. At that time in the country there was an interim government which was for a temporary basis, for a temporary period of time, and after that the first ever elected government would be chosen. Now in 1950, when the Constitution of India was written, the Election Commission was set up in 1950, and 𝓒𝓱𝓪𝓾𝓱𝓪 became the first Chief Election Commissioner of the country. Now what would happen after setting up the Election Commission of India? Of course you have to hold the elections in the country, but holding elections in the country was not an easy task. Many people thought that in 1950 itself there would be the first elections of the country, but that never happened, because for holding election there were two major tasks. First was the delimitation. Delimitation refers to drawing up the boundaries of all those constituencies, because you can't hold election in each and every district of the country. Constituencies, the boundaries of the constituencies has to be drawn up, and that is why delimitation was the first task. Second was the electoral roll. Now electoral roll is a list of all the eligible voters in a particular constituencies, because all the eligible voters, there has to be some list, otherwise what would happen? A person in a particular constituency, suppose a constituency, would be voting in many other constituencies as well, and that is why electoral roll becomes important in an election. And when the draft of the first electoral roll came up, there were nearly around 40 lakh names of women which were not written. They were simply written off as wife of or daughter of someone. That means that their individual name was not included in that list, and that is why the Election Commission refused to accept it, because for holding free and fair elections you need to have the name of all the eligible voters in the country. Secondly, the boundaries of all the constituencies should be clearly marked out. Thirdly, it was on a very large scale. The elections at that time were at a large scale. Around 17 crore eligible voters in the country were there, who had to elect around 489 members of Lok Sabha and 3200 MLAs. MLAs, as you know, that members of legislative assemblies. So you can say that 489 members of Lok Sabha and 3200 members of MLAs, of legislative assemblies. So it was a very large number. Third point was that among 17 crore eligible voters, only around 15% were literate. So we had to conduct a method of voting for which literate as well as illiterate people both could have access to that method, and that is why it is a huge task to hold elections in the country. Another thing was that at that time democracy was considered a luxury for prosperous countries, because it existed only in the countries, majorly in the countries of Europe and North American continent, and even in that continent, even in many European countries, universal adult franchise had not been adopted. The right to vote to women was not at all given in many of the European countries even at that time, and India at first go just after independence gave universal adult franchise. That means right to vote to every adult citizen of India, and that is why it was considered as a very bold and risky decision by the Indian leaders. Now at that time there were many critiques that came up which considered it as a farce or as the biggest gamble in the history, or as a mistake of our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, because to establish democracy in a newly independent nation which was facing financial problems, which was not having social connections, and even inside the country there were many factions. So of course there would be many problems with democracy, and that is why there were many critiques that came up. But the first ever general elections of the country were held between the period of October 1951 to February 1952. Now, as you know that in election there is not just voting or just polling booth, there are many provisions, there were many practices, like election campaigns are there, the announcement of the result, the announcement of the election dates are there, there is a code of conduct for elections as well. So there were many processes, and that is why it took about 6 months to hold up all the elections in the country. It was from the period of October 1951 to February 1952, but collectively it is called as the general elections of 1952 because elections in most of the constituencies were held up in 1952, and as expected the result was the victory of Indian National Congress. Now the result of the first ever general elections in the country was accepted by everyone in the country. More than 50% of the eligible voters turned to vote on the voting day, and that is why it is considered as the victory of democracy in the country, because at that time no one in the world, not just in India but in the world, had accepted this outcome. All of the countries at that time, all of the major international powers at that time considered it as a failure. But after the result, after the unexpected outcome of the result, first ever general elections came up, then it turned as a victory of democracy in the country, and then it was seen that democracy could exist in a country which was lacking education as well, in a country which was having poverty on such a large scale as well, and that is why it was not at all limited to just prosperous countries in the world. So we can say that it was considered as an example for other countries as well, because other countries which were less prosperous, which were underdeveloped countries, now could see it as an inspiration for their own countries as well. Now next thing comes that after general elections, what about the result of the elections? Who won? Who lost? Now let's see that as well. So next topic here is Congress dominance in the first 3 general elections. So Congress dominance in the first 3 general elections. Now the outcome of the first general elections in 1952 came up, and as expected, the result was as expected. The outcome was in the favor of the Indian National Congress. Now the Congress party was a party which had inherited the legacy of the national movement of the country. So of course it was expected that the first general elections would be won by them. And not just first, even the second and third general elections, Congress party had majority of the seats won in those elections. Now while talking about the outcome, it was of course unexpected, but the extent of their winning, extent of their victory in the country, of the seats that they had won, did surprise many. In the first general elections of 1952, the Congress party got 364 seats out of 489 seats of Lok Sabha. So you can see the extent of the votes, extent of the seats that they had won. The second largest party in terms of seats was the Communist Party of India, which got only 16 seats in the country's Lok Sabha. So you can say that there was a vast difference between the Congress party and the second number party, which was the Communist Party of the country. So you can say that the extent of the victory of the Indian National Congress was large as well, and there were many reasons behind it. First, of course, because it had a major role in the national movement of the country. Secondly, it had the most popular leader at that time, most popular leader of the Indian politics at that time, which was Jawaharlal Nehru, as a young and charismatic leader as well. Thirdly, because it had a well organized structure in the country. All over the country it had well organized structure, and that is why it had gotten very big victory in the country. 364 seats out of 489 seats, around 3/4 of the seats you can say. Now 489 seats were in the Lok Sabha at that time. Now in the present time it has more seats around in Lok Sabha. Now at the present time there are 543 seats plus 2 appointed members in the country. So you can say that you don't have to be confused in the numbers, because in past there were 489 seats and then now there are 543 seats. Now in the first Lok Sabha elections, of course, Indian National Congress had gotten a very good victory. What about the state elections? In state elections as well, Congress had formed government in all the states, except some having exceptions. There were some exceptions where it was hard to form the government. For instance, Travancore Cochin region of the country, which included the parts of today's Kerala, Madras and those regions. So you can say that in southern part of the country, in the Kerala region of the country, it was hard for Congress party to make government, but at last they had formed the government in those regions as well. Second instance was in the 1957 state elections. 1957, which means the second general elections of the country. Now in that election in Kerala state of the country, Congress failed to form the government. Their Communist Party of India, CPI of the country, formed the government. So we can say that there were some exceptions or some rare cases where Congress failed to form the government, but on a large scale, overall, if we see the situation in the whole country in the Lok Sabha elections, Congress had formed the government. Second, the extent of the victory of the Congress party had been boosted up due to our election system as well. As we have already studied in class 11th about the first past the post election method that has been adopted in the country, you see that the Congress party had won 3/4 of the seats, while it got even less than 50% of the votes. So how is it that it got 50% of the votes while it got more than 70% of the seats? Because in India we have first past the post system. Similarly, if we talk about the Socialist Party, now in terms of votes, if we look at just at the votes, not the seats won by the party, it was the second largest party in the first general elections. In that election, it got around 10% of the vote by the people, but it could not have even 3% of the seats. So we can say that in first past the post system, all the political parties get more than their proportional share of the votes, and that is why the extent of the victory of the Congress party had been boosted up. But of course it was expected, because you see that it had been formed as a major party of the country, being the oldest political party of the country and being such a large, well-organized party of the country, and that is why in the first 3 elections it had clear majority. In the first election in 1952, second general election 1957, and third general election in 1962. In all these 3 elections, the Congress party had clear majority, around 3/4 of the seats of the country. So we can say that it had clear dominance of the country. So if it had dominance in the country, then what about the nature of that dominance? Let's see that nature as well. So nature of Congress dominance. Now whenever we say one party system or one party rule, what comes to your mind? Of course democracy just goes off. Just see an example of China. In China there is one party rule, which is Communist Party of China. What does it show? It shows that there is no democracy, there is no clear good democracy in that country. So how can we say that the one party dominance of the Congress party was democratic? Because we are saying that India is a democratic country and has been always democratic country after independence. So doesn't it contradict each other? Because if we look at the case of China Syria or Cuba, in those countries the constitution allows only one party rule. In China there can only be one party, which is the Chinese Communist Party. Other parties have to be elite parties. But what about India? There was no such restrictions in the country. In the country there were proper elections, there were proper procedures that held up. There were proper free and fair elections that were held out in the country, and that is why we can say that even though the Indian National Congress formed the government many times continuously, but it was through democratic processes. It was not through one party dominance, but it was through democratic processes, and that is why we can't say that democracy was ruled out from the country. We can't say that. Secondly, if we look at the case of let's look at the case of South Africa. Now, after the end of apartheid system of South Africa, which party has been dominating that country? Of course, African National Congress, because it had a major role in eradicating the policy of apartheid. So the same goes for India. In India, the constitution allowed all the parties to contest elections, but because the Indian National Congress had the major public opinion, public support at that time, and that is why it formed the government. Other countries such as Myanmar, Belarus, Egypt, Eritrea, there is like military rule, there are legal provisions, but in India there are no such military or legal provisions for one party dominance, and that is why the nature of the Congress one party dominance in the country has been considered democratic. Now, second point that comes here is, even if it was through democratic processes, then still was democracy being practiced on practical situation? What about the role of opposition? Because we saw a large gap between the opposition and the ruling party. The Communist Party of India got 16 seats in the first general elections, while the Indian National Congress got 364 seats. Then wouldn't that be that opposition would be very weak in the Lok Sabha? Now, when you see the Congress Party, you see that it had been established around in 1885, which means that at the time of independence, it had established itself as a very well-structured, organized party. It had been spread all over the country, be it north, south, east or west. It had been spread all over the country through the length and breadth of the country. Secondly, all those forefront leaders of the national movement, national freedom struggle, were contesting elections as Congress candidates. So what could the public do? Of course, they had to vote those people, and of course, if they were voting those people, then the Congress Party would win. So because of the being inheritor of the legacy of the national movement, it had gotten major victory. And if we talk about the structure of the National Congress, we already know that it was such a large party that it had been considered as a very big inclusive party, because it has been established not just as a political party, as a national movement it had been established. So let's see how it had been established, the nature of the Indian National Congress as well, with the subtopic that is Congress as social and ideological coalition. So Congress as a social and ideological coalition. Now let's see how we consider the Congress Party as a coalition of social values and ideological values. Now, as you know that Congress Party, the Indian National Congress, emerged in 1885 as a pressure group for the elite classes of the society, for the newly educated section of the society, for the upper class of the society. But with time, it had an eventual transformation. With every civil disobedience movement it launched in the 20th century, you see that the Congress Party had a major transformation in the 20th century. With every civil disobedience movement it launched, it had included many other diverse sections of the society, and often they were contradictory to each other. With the starting phase, they were only having the upper classes of the society society, upper caste, upper middle class, the elite classes and the educated classes. But with time, with civil disobedience movement in the 20th century, now there were peasants and owners, urban dwellers and villagers, industrialists and workers. You see that these pairs are contradictory to each other, but still they had been included in the Congress party. So we can say that socially they had become a coalition with each other, and over the time in the 20th century, when the Congress party from a pressure group for the highly elite classes of the society to it became a national movement of the country for the freedom struggle. We can say that for independence of the country, it had gotten a major transformation. It became a rainbow-like structure for all the numerous groups. It became a kind of platform for all the numerous groups. When we say about ideology, in terms of ideology as well, Congress is seen as a coalition at that time. Why? Because it included pacifist as well as revolutionary, extremist as well as moderates, we can say radicals, as well as many other different ideological people were in the Congress party. So it has been considered as a coalition rather than a single type of party, and that is why we say that even if the Congress party was dominating the political system of the country at that time, but still it itself was so diverse. It itself was representing all the sections of the society, because there were different numerous groups in the Congress party which were thinking of, which were having different opinions, which were having different interests, which were having different ambitions. And that is why, rather than being a political party, Indian National Congress at that time was considered as a platform for numerous groups to have their interest shown, to share their interest, to work for their interest, and that is why it's considered a coalition. Now another thing is that when they are all a coalition, then of course it was having inclusiveness of different societies, and it was including the interest of all the sections of the society. So we can say that just as in the starting phase, as it was just for elite class of the society, now it was for all the sections of the society. Now second point in the Congress party was the tolerance and management of factions. Now first of all, what are factions? So we say that there were different numerous groups in the Congress party. Secondly, there were different kind of leaders with different ideologies, some being pacifist, some being revolutionary, some being extremist, and that's why they formed their own groups even within the Congress party. These groups are called factions in the Congress party. Now factions are based on the idea of compromissive inclusiveness, because if you're having faction, if you're having coalitional type of political party, then there would be compromise. Otherwise, how would all those contradictory sections of the society, contradictory groups exist with each other, exist all together? And that is why compromise is the first point. Secondly, there would be inclusiveness. That means that you're having different numerous groups with having different mindsets, different ideologies, and that's why these 2 points, compromissive inclusiveness, proved to be very good strengths of the Indian National Congress. Another thing is that when they are different factions, now when we say factions, it arises negative thoughts in the mind, that if there is a committee, if there is a big organization and there are many factions in that organization, then what would happen? It would lead to disunity of that faction, or it may break down. But in the Congress party, it was just the opposite. Congress itself encouraged the factions, the coming up of factions. Why? Because firstly, with having having so many factions, it had many kind of ideas. So whenever an opposition wanted to say something, it was already included in the Congress party due to having different factions. Because if different kind of factions are existing within the Congress party, then all of them would want their own profit, all of them would want their own interest to be fulfilled first, and that is why as a ruling party, Congress would have to listen to them. Otherwise, how would they maintain their position as a ruling party? So we can say that with the presence of factions, it was having all the ideologies that no opposition party could have a question on. Secondly, if there are so many factions, then there would be greater tolerance among those factions as well. And that is why even if the factions were not happy with the policies or programs of Congress, instead of forming their own parties, they were instead fighting the opposition parties. So it was they were having greater tolerance compared to other political parties. So with having factions within the Congress party, what happened that firstly there were inclusiveness of different ideologies, so that opposition would not have any flaw, any fault. It would not have any chance to find any flaw in the policies of Congress party. Secondly, there would be greater tolerance and greater unity among them. So we can say that instead of forming parties, many leaders considered the unity of the Congress, and that's why it survived as a political party for a long time. And that's why the first decade after independence, because the Congress was dominating at that time, it's considered as Congress system instead of political system of the country, due to the dominance, the large extent of dominance of the Congress party. And that's why Congress at that time is not just considered as a ruling party of the country, it was considered as the opposition party of the country as well, because the factions were the ones who were pressurizing, criticizing, influencing the policies and programs of the Congress party. Because the Congress party, it was not just a political party, it appeared as a platform. So what would happen? It would have to listen to all the different people which it was having, all the different factions it had to listen. All the factions were in different states as well. You see that Congress had formed many different state congress, and in those state congress as well there were many factions. So these factions were the one who were actually controlling, criticizing, pressurizing, influencing the rules, regulation, the policy programming of the Congress party. So that's why we can say that the Congress party did not just emerge as a ruling party. Instead, it emerged as an opposition party as well. It was playing the role of both the things, and that's why we can say that the nature or the dominance of the Congress party is considered democratic politics. It's not considered as non-democratic in the country, just as in China, Cuba or Syria, but it's different from those countries because it's based on democracy. There are democratic proceedings, there are democratic processes. Then how can we say that it's not democratic? And that's why we can say that nature of the Congress dominance is considered as democratic. Now after Congress, after the first decade, after 15-20 years, there came a phase when the opposition parties started emerging as well. So how did they start emerging? Let's study about them as well with the next topic, which is emergence of opposition parties. So emergence of opposition parties. Now, as we have already studied about some of the opposition parties, as we have seen that apart from the Indian National Congress, of course, there were many other opposition parties in the government of India as well. For instance, the Communist Party of the country, the Socialist Party of India. There were many parties that were present in the country and were considered as the opposition parties. However, we say that they played an important role or emerged as major parties in the 50s and 60s of the country, which means that the time period between the 1950s to 1960s, at that time the role of the opposition parties was considered as a major role in the politics of the country. Secondly, we can say that all the major parties of today's time that we see today on the news, as you might be seeing that at the time of election there are many parties that are campaigning. So all those major parties of today's time, present times era, have their origins from the opposition parties of the 1950s or 1960s of one or another. So they trace back their origins to those opposition parties. The question as well, because the opposition parties are the ones that are keeping a sustained and a practical criticism, a professional criticism of the policies and practices of the ruling party. They are the ones, the opposition parties are the ones that keep the ruling party under check and groom the personalities of the leaders that have to play a crucial role in the country's politics. So we can say that the opposition parties play a crucial role in shaping the policy of the ruling party as well. Secondly, to keep them under check, they are important as well. And in the early years of the politics of the country, in the first and second general elections, you see that there was a mutual respect between the ruling leaders and the opposing leaders. You see, Jawaharlal Nehru from the ruling party, Indian National Congress, was very fond of the Socialist Party, which was an opposition party. He was also fond of many other opposing leaders, such as Dr. Ambedkar. So we had many such great opposition leaders, such as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, J.P. Narayan. So we can say that there were many opposition leaders. And from the time of independence, from the time of the dominance of the Congress, we have seen a lot of opposition parties. Though they had a very less representation in the government of India, still they played a crucial role in the politics of the country. Now let's see some of the important opposition parties of that time as well. Now you see that not of that time, not of today's time. So first of all in our list is the Communist Party of India. Even in the first general election, it got 16 seats, the second largest party in terms of seats. Now the Communist Party, as the name suggests, is of course based on the idea of socialism. It was formed around 1920, and firstly it was inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. You have already studied about the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution. So it was inspired from the Bolshevik Revolution of Russia. Secondly, it was based on the idea of socialism. After that, we see that Communist Party had a major base in areas in states such as Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal and Bihar. And its policies, you can see ideologies were revolved around socialism. And in the early days, you see, at the time of independence, it had even incited many violent uprisings in the country because it considered independence as not a true independence of the country, and that is why it incited many uprisings in Telangana, in southern part of the country. After that, it had not gotten so much popular support of the people, and that is why in 1951 it decided to participate in the general elections of the country, and it became the first Communist Party in the world to form the government through democratic elections. As we have already seen that in 1957, in the second general elections of the country, in Kerala State Assembly, it formed the government. So we can say that Communist Party of India became the first ever communist party to hold government, to form the government through a democratic method. Though later on the government was rejected. Why was it rejected? You know that in 1957 it got 60 out of 126 seats in Kerala state government, in Kerala State Legislative Assembly. After that, there were many uprisings that were seen in Kerala, and the central government at that time, which was the Congress government, considered it as a liberal agitation, and that is why under Article 356, which talks about the president's rule which can be imposed on any state in case of constitutional failures. So under Article 356, the Congress established rule in Kerala. So we can say that though it was considered very controversial, it was considered, the Article 356 was considered controversial and the power of Congress as well at that time. So we can say that the CPI formed the government in Kerala in 1956 and 1957, though later on it was rejected by the Congress government. Another thing is that in 1964 it saw a major split down. The Communist Party of India saw two major split out. First was in 1934 when it split ways from the Congress Party. Second one was in 1964 when the Communist Party itself was split in two parties. First was the supporter of the pro-Soviet Union, that is of course the USSR. The USSR, which disintegrated in 1991. So first, that was the major party, the main party, CPI, Communist Party of India, remained as it is. Second, the new party that came off in 1964 was the Communist Party of India, Marxism, which followed the idea of Chinese communism as well. So we can say that it saw a major split down in 1964 and has major bases in Kerala, West Bengal, Bihar and Andhra Pradesh. And some of the notable leaders of the Communist Party of India are S.A. Ding, EMS 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪, there is Ajay Ghosh, and there are many leaders who were notable of Communist Party of India. The next party that comes off in our list of opposition parties is Socialist Party. Now Socialist Party, this party was also based on the idea of socialism, but still it was different from the Congress Party and the Communist Party because it considered socialism to be established in a democratic manner, while the Communist Party was an extremist party. So we can say that Socialist Party, and you know that many of the today's parties such as Samajwadi Party, Janata Dal United, Janata Dal Secular, Rashtriya Janata Dal, these parties have their origins somewhat connected to the Socialist Party. Many of the state parties, many of the state socialist parties have their origin from this Socialist Party as well. So we can say that this Socialist Party at that time was a major opposition party, though later on it had not done very well in the elections. It had gotten votes but had not gotten seats, as we saw that in the first election it got 10% of the votes but got less than 3% of the seats, and that's why it led to the public disappointment. Some major leaders of the Socialist Party were 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪, or in short JB Narayan, whom Jawaharlal Nehru was very fond of. You know what, that in the first cabinet of the country he even invited him to be a part of the Congress Party. Other notable leaders were Ram Manohar Lohia, JP Narayan, many Ashoka Mehta. We can say that there were many leaders in the Socialist Party. Now talking about the origins of the Socialist Party, it traces its origin from the Indian National Congress itself. Now in 1934 there emerged a party within the Congress Party, which was the Congress Socialist Party. Now at that time you see that Congress was at the state of mass movement. Even from the pre-independence era it emerged as a mass movement stage, and at that time the Socialist Party was formed within the Congress. Now in 1948 the Congress Party amended its constitution and rejected the idea of dual membership of parties, and that's why the socialist leaders had to form another party, Socialist Party, because they could not be a member of Socialist Party as well as the Congress Party in the Congress itself, and that's why they had to form another party, Socialist Party. So the Socialist Party was formed from the Congress Party in 1948. It included notable leaders, young leaders who wanted democratic socialism in the country, but they faced a dilemma in 1955 when the Congress Party declared its goal to be a socialist pattern of the society, because earlier than that the Socialist Party always criticized the Congress Party for ignoring the peasants, for ignoring the workers and supporting the capitalists capitalists, the industrialists, the landlords of the society. But in 1955, the Congress Party declared their goal to be the socialist pattern of the society. Now, how Socialist Party is different from Congress Party? Because they both are having the same ideology, they are providing the same policies, and that's why as an alternative the Socialist Party fell off, and now it can be traced as an origin for many of the today's contemporary political parties. Another opposition party of that time, a notable party, is Bharatiya Jana Sangh. Now, Bharatiya Jana Sangh becomes important because today's ruling party, in 2024's ruling party, Bharatiya Janata Party, traces its origin from Bharatiya Jana Sangh itself. Bharatiya Jana Sangh was formed in 1951 by 𝓒𝓫𝓱𝓪 Mukherjee as its founder president. The party included notable leaders such as 𝓒𝓫𝓱𝓪 Mukherjee, Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay, Balraj Madhok. You see that this party has an ideology of Hindutva. You have already studied about the different political parties and their ideologies. So Bharatiya Jana Sangh had an ideology of Hindutva, which means that India can be progressive. There can be modernization in India by taking the traditions, by taking the culture of India itself. Secondly, it had an ideology of one culture, one country and one nation, and that's why it even had an attempt to reunite India and Pakistan as an Akhand Bharat, although it failed. Another thing, as I've already said, that it wanted modernization in the country by taking the traditions and culture of the country, and that is why the coming up of English was not at all with the ideology of this party, and that's why it was on the forefront of all those movements against the choice of English as the official language of country. They wanted Hindi to be the official language of the country. So we can say that they have an ideology of Hindutva. Another thing is that Bharatiya Jana Sangh has had a major support from many organizations such as RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak and Hindu Mahasabha. So we can say that it has a major backing up as well. And leaders such as 𝓒𝓫𝓱𝓪 Mukherjee at that time were notable leaders as opposition leaders in the cabinet of the country. In the you see that by Jawaharlal Nehru they had been praised as well. So we can say that Bharatiya Jana Sangh, which is the origin of Bharatiya Janata Party, today's ruling party, was an important opposition party of that time as well. Now, talking about the support of this party, it came majorly from the Hindi speaking areas of the northern India, such as from Rajasthan, from Uttar Pradesh, from Madhya Pradesh, from Bihar, because these areas considered the population of Hindi speaking people. And secondly, talking about the social classes, they were mainly supported by the upper classes, the rich classes of the society. Although now Bharatiya Janata Party is supported by different sections of the society, but at that time Bharatiya Jana Sangh was supported by the higher sections of the society. So we have seen major opposition parties that had emerged at the time of 1950s to 1960s, and you have to remember that these parties, one or another, are the origins of contemporary political parties, contemporary political opposition parties, as well as the ruling parties, all those non-Congress parties, we can say. Now, next and the last topic of this chapter is changing methods of voting. Now, we have already discussed about the elections, about different things related to elections, but what about the methods of voting? Today we vote using the EVMs, electronic voting machines, but from the first general election, has it been the same? No, it hasn't been. Earlier in the first general election, the method was completely different. At that time, people used ballot papers. There were a box for each candidate in each polling booth. Suppose if there is a constituency, there is a polling booth, then there would be a candidate. If there are 5 candidates, then there would be 5 boxes in each booth. In each box there would be the name written of that candidate, the number of that constituency, the number of the polling booth, and the number of the polling station as well. And there would be a presiding officer of the election commission who would sign on the paper which would be writing all those information. So we can say that earlier the method was different. After two elections, after the first two general election, the method was again changed. Earlier what happened, people had just had to put a blank ballot paper in the candidate's box and then they would be counted. But now the ballot paper contained the names, the parties, the symbols of all the candidates for that particular constituency. And now the voters had to put a stamp on their favored candidate, who they wanted to prefer, who they wanted to vote. So we can say that after the first two general elections, the method was again changed, and this method nearly worked for 40 years. In 1990s, after the 1990s, this was again changed, and nearly in all the country EVMs started to be introduced. So we can say that earlier ballot paper method was used, now the EVMs are used for elections in the country. And that's how we complete the chapter. In this chapter we have studied about how India established democracy in the country. We have seen that how the first general elections of the country was a huge major task for the election commission. Around 3 lakh officers of the election commission had to be trained for the elections in the country. Around 17 crore eligible voters were there. Only 15% of them were literate. Then we saw that in the first general election, the first 3 general election, the Congress party was dominating, and how the nature of the dominance of Congress party is democratic, and how the Congress has established democracy in the country, how the democratic politics in the country has been instituted. And we also saw that not just the Congress party, but there were also opposition parties which helped in instituting the democracy in the country. So that's all we have studied in this chapter. I have covered all the topics and subtopics, and the next chapters of this book will be covered in the further upcoming videos. So stay tuned for upcoming videos. Thank you very much.